One of the significant consequences of Erasmus's new critical edition of the Bible, that is, an edition that tried to get as close as possible to the original text, was that it raised questions about the authority, the authenticity of the Latin text that had been used for so long by the Catholic Church. This was not Erasmus's intent, but it was a clear consequence. Among other things, in his Novum Testamentum, as the new translation was called, Erasmus pointed to a number of places in the text that he says were simply not there in the original Greek. One of the most famous comes from two verses in 1 John chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, where there is a fairly clear reference to the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. These three are one. The Trinity is an important Christian doctrine, doctrine established early in Christian church history. And Erasmus wasn't disputing the accuracy or the truth of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, but he simply said, in the earliest versions of the Greek, this isn't there, and he identified exactly in the 10th or 11th century when that verse was introduced by a well-meaning biblical scribe who said, well, we should have a clear reference in the New Testament to the Trinity, and so it was simply inserted. That raised questions in people's minds, even though, again, the goal was to defend the church. It raised questions about what other parts of the Catholic Bible might come into question. There were other sources of the Reformation that I want to quickly call your attention to. Clearly, the crises of the 14th century, the famine, the plague, the war, raised doubts in people's minds about whether the church traditional understandings of God's presence in history could be trusted. And then, of course, the fact that papal authority itself came into question when we had one and then two and finally three popes, the Babylonian captivity of the church, and a kind of crisis that was only resolved by calling a council, that is, representatives of the church, who in effect claimed to have greater authority than the Pope himself when they set matters straight. The 14th and 15th century popes were also notorious for their disinterest in spiritual matters and the fact that they were more interested in many cases in overseeing the church's property. The church owned a great deal of property, and they were in effect feudal lords. One of the most infamous was Julius II, depicted here in his full regalia of armor. This is not the armor, spiritual armor that Paul talks about. It's the armor of a feudal lord. And he also had himself depicted in a very famous statue of him riding a war horse as he went off to fight to defend the Pope's territories. There is also the fact of corruption, even though it's not the only reason for the Protestant Reformation. The 15th century saw a rise in new practices that we look back on and say this is not the church at its best. One of them, the practice of simony, which comes from the story in the book of Acts of Simon Magistris, a magician who wanted to buy Peter's ability to heal, the secret of Peter's success as a healer. And Peter says, no, the Spirit of God cannot be sold. Simony is the sale of church offices. Plural benefices is the fact that some individuals began to hold many offices at the same time. So you could have two bishoprics and be an archbishop and a cardinal and collect the revenue all at the same time. The sale of indulgences was also a widespread practice at the time of the Reformation. An indulgence is a piece of paper, we see it here, that buys time out of purgatory if you pay a certain amount of money to the church. A growing sense of apocalypticism, a sense that Christ was going to return any day, brought about by the plague, by fears of Islam, a sense that the history itself was coming undone. And then the impact of the printing press. You can imagine the Reformation happening without Luther. It couldn't have happened without